The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was picturesque, almost timeless, with its cobblestone streets and quaint houses. For most residents, life was simple, filled with the routines of small-town living. But for James Hartford, life had been anything but simple. James was a man of stature, not just in his physical presence, but in the way he carried himself. At 80 years old, he moved with a deliberate grace, the product of a life lived with purpose. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who had built his empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Yet for all his success, there was a deep-seated loneliness in James. He had never married, had no children, and the few friends he once had either passed on or drifted away. The town respected him, admired him even, but there was always a sense of distance, as if a veil separated him from the rest of. One cool autumn morning, James sat at the small oak desk in his study, sipping his coffee as he did every morning. The study was a reflection of his life, meticulously organized, every object in its place. Framed photographs of his younger self, standing beside various business ventures, lined the walls. The only personal photograph was one of his parents, long deceased, who had never lived to see their son's success. James was not a man prone to surprises. His days followed a strict routine, a schedule he rarely deviated from. But as he opened his mail that morning, one envelope caught his attention. It was different from the others, smaller, and the handwriting on it was elegant, almost familiar. He hesitated before opening it, a strange sense of anticipation building in his chest. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the brief message, and he felt a jolt in his chest. The letter was from Amelia Davis, a name he hadn't heard in over 60 years. The memories came flooding back, unbidden and overwhelming. Amelia had been his first love, a woman he had thought about often but had never dared to reach out to. They had parted ways under circumstances that had left him with more regret than he cared to admit. The letter was short, almost cryptic. Amelia had written, "James, it's been too long. There are things we need to talk about. If you're willing, I'd like to see Amelia." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades of unspoken emotions. Why now, after all these years? What could she possibly want to discuss? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more pressing than the last. James folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He sat there for a long time, staring out the window at the autumn leaves falling gently to the ground. The past was something he had always tried to keep at bay, preferring to focus on the present, on the tangible results of his hard work. But Amelia's letter had opened a door to a part of his life he had long buried, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront it. The decision to visit the coastal town where he had last seen Amelia was not an easy one. James spent several days pondering the implications. What if this meeting stirred up old wounds that had never fully healed? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that not knowing would haunt him far more than anything that could happen. And so, with a resolve he hadn't felt in years, James packed a small suitcase and set off for the town of Seabrook. Seabrook was a stark contrast to Willow Creek. Where Willow Creek was quiet and serene, Seabrook was lively and vibrant, with the scent of salt water in the air and the sound of waves crashing against the shore. It was a place that held memories, some of which James wasn't sure he was ready to relive. But as he drove down the familiar streets, he felt a strange sense of calm. This was where it had all started, and perhaps where it needed to end. He found the art gallery easily enough. It was a small, unassuming building near the waterfront, with large windows that displayed various paintings and sculptures. As James stood outside gathering his thoughts, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Amelia had led all these years. Had she found happiness? Had she ever thought of him? The door to the gallery opened with a soft chime, and James stepped inside. The interior was quiet, the kind of quiet that invited contemplation. Paintings lined the walls, each one more beautiful than the last, but James barely noticed them. His attention was focused solely on the woman standing behind the counter, her back to him as she arranged some papers. She was older now, of course, but there was no mistaking her. Amelia. Amelia? James's voice was steady, but inside, he felt anything but. She turned slowly, and when their eyes met, it was as if no time had passed at all. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with years of distance that had suddenly closed in an instant. "James," Amelia finally said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "You came." "I did," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if I should, but here I am." Amelia nodded, her eyes searching his face as if looking for the young man she once knew. "There's a lot to talk about," she said after a moment. "More than I can put into words right now." James simply nodded, the enormity of the moment sinking in. He had come here for answers, but now that he was standing in front of her, he realized that the questions were far more complex than he had anticipated. But whatever the answers were, they would have to wait. For now, they simply stood there, two people connected by a shared past, unsure of where to begin. James stood in front of one of Amelia's paintings, but his thoughts were miles away, drifting back to a time when life was simpler and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. The year was 1957, and he was a young man full of ambition, with the world at his feet. Back then, Seabrook was different, smaller, less polished, but the beach had always been there, a constant backdrop to their summer romance. He could still see her, the way the sunlight played off her auburn hair as they walked along the shoreline, their hands intertwined. They had met at a local dance, one of those summer nights that seemed to stretch on forever. James had been captivated by her laughter, by the way she seemed to light up the room just by being in it. They were inseparable that summer, sharing dreams of the future, talking about the lives they would build together. But as the summer waned, reality began to intrude on their idyllic world. James had dreams of his own, big dreams. He wanted to make something of himself, to rise above the small-town life that had always felt too confining. Amelia, on the other hand, was content with a simpler. She loved Seabrook, the sea, the art she created in her small studio. She had no desire to leave, and that difference, though small at first, grew into a chasm that neither of them knew how to bridge. James remembered the day he told her he was leaving. It was a cool, windy afternoon, and they were sitting on the same beach where they had spent so many happy hours. He had expected her to understand, to support him, but the look on her face when he told her of his plans was something he would never. "I can't stay here, Amelia," he had said, his voice thick with frustration. "I need more. I want to build something, to be someone. I thought you'd understand." She had been silent for a long time, just staring out at the ocean. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was an edge of sadness that cut him to the core. "I do understand, James, but I don't want to leave this place. It's my home. It's where I belong." And just like that, the future they had dreamed of together began to. James left Seabrook a few weeks later, promising to stay in touch, to come back for her once he was established. But life had a way of getting in the way. One business deal led to another, and before he knew it, years had passed, and the distance between them had grown too wide to cross. Now, standing in Amelia's gallery, the weight of those choices bore down on him. What had he really gained in the end? Wealth? Yes, but at what cost? His life was a series of successful ventures, but his heart had always carried the burden of that loss. He had let the one person who truly understood him slip away, all for the sake of ambition. His eyes flickered back to the painting in front of him, a scene of the Seabrook shoreline at sunset. The colors were warm and inviting, yet tinged with a melancholy that felt all too familiar. This was Amelia's world, a world she had built without him. And it was beautiful in a way that his success could. The days that followed were a delicate dance between the past and the present. James and Amelia began to spend time together, not out of some grand rekindling of romance, but out of a shared history that seemed to pull them back to one another. Each interaction was layered with years of unspoken words, with memories that lingered just beneath the surface. They walked through the town, visiting old haunts that had remained remarkably unchanged. The local diner where they used to share milkshakes was still there, the booths worn with time but familiar. As they sat down, the waitress, a woman in her 60s who had clearly been there for years, gave them a knowing smile. "James Hartford and Amelia Davis together again," she said with a hint of amusement. "It's like the old days." James smiled politely, but inside, he felt a pang of discomfort. The town knew their history, knew the paths their lives had taken. It made everything feel more public, more scrutinized than he was comfortable with. Amelia seemed to sense his unease and changed the subject. "Do you remember the time we tried to build a bonfire on the beach, and it wouldn't light?" James chuckled, the memory coming back to him with surprising clarity. "How could I forget? We spent half the night gathering driftwood, only to have the wind blow it all out." They laughed, the tension between them easing slightly. But for all their shared memories, there was an unspoken barrier between them. Amelia was guarded, careful not to let the past dictate their present. She had built a life without him, a life that was rich and fulfilling in its own right. And while she was willing to reconnect, she wasn't willing to let old wounds reopen. James, on the other hand, was eager, perhaps too eager, to bridge the gap between them. He wanted to understand her, to know the person she had become in the years they had been. But every question he asked seemed to touch on something delicate, something she wasn't ready to share. Their conversations were tinged with nostalgia, but also with a cautious hope. They spoke of the art she created, of the gallery she had built from the ground up. Amelia had found a sense of purpose in her work, a contentment that James envied. He too had found success, but it had come at the cost of the simpler, more profound joys that Amelia seemed to have held on to. The townspeople watched their interactions with quiet interest, as if waiting for some grand conclusion to a story that had been left unfinished for too long. James felt the weight of their expectations, the unspoken hope that perhaps, after all these years, something might finally be resolved. But as they walked through the town, revisiting the places where their younger selves had once dreamed of a future together, it became clear that their relationship was far more complex than it had ever been. They were no longer the same people they had once been, and the love they had shared, while still present in some form, was now tempered by years of distance and the lives they had led apart. They ended their day at the beach, sitting on the same stretch of sand where they had said their goodbyes all those years ago. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the water, and for a moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the world. "I never thought I'd see this place again," James said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Amelia smiled softly. "Neither did I, but here we are." James nodded, the enormity of the moment sinking in. They had come full circle, returning to the place where it had all started. But whether they could move forward from here, whether they could find some measure of peace and understanding, was something that neither of them could predict. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the past still heavy between them, but no longer unbearable. The turning point in their relationship came the next day, during a visit to the local lighthouse. It was a place they had often visited in their youth, a secluded spot where they could be alone, away from the prying eyes of the town. As they climbed the winding stairs to the top, the air between them was thick with ennui. When they reached the top, they stood in silence for a while, taking in the panoramic view of the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a constant rhythmic reminder of the passage of time. James turned to Amelia, hoping to break the silence, but before he could speak, she turned to him with a look of determination on her face. "There's something I need to tell you, James," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. "Something I've kept hidden all these years." James felt his heart skip a beat. The gravity of her tone told him that whatever she was about to reveal would change everything. "What is it, Amelia?" She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what was to come. "The reason I stayed in Seabrook, the reason I didn't go with you all those years ago, It wasn't just because I loved this town. It was because I was pregnant. James stared at her, the words sinking in slowly, like a heavy stone dropped into deep water. "Pregnant?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to hold you back. I knew how much your dreams meant to you, and I didn't want to be the reason you gave them up. So I made the decision to stay here, to raise the baby on my own." James felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. The revelation was like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice thick. "Because I was scared," Amelia admitted, her voice trembling. "I was scared that you would feel trapped, that you would resent me, and I was scared that if you stayed, you would always wonder what could have been." James's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what she was saying. A child, his child. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Amelia looked away, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken pain. "The baby didn't make it," she said quietly. "It was a difficult pregnancy and I lost her." James felt his heart break for the woman standing in front of him, for the pain she had endured alone, for the life they might have had together if things had been different. He reached out, taking her hand in his voice choked with regret. "Amelia, I'm so sorry. I should have been there for you." Tears streamed down Amelia's face as she looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sorrow and something else. Something that looked like forgive. "It wasn't your fault, James. We both made choices and we both have to live with them. But maybe it's not too late to start over." The revelation had shifted everything between them. The past they had been trying to reconcile was now seen through a new lens, and the conflict that had kept them apart for so long was no longer insurmountable. For the first time in decades, James felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, despite everything, they could still find their way back to each. The revelation of Amelia's secret had left James reeling. As they descended the stairs of the lighthouse, the weight of their past felt heavier than ever. The knowledge that they could have shared a life together, a family, made the years they had spent apart seem even more tragic. And now, standing at this critical juncture in his life, James knew he had a choice to make, one that would determine not just his future, but Amelia's as well. That evening, as they sat in Amelia's small but cozy living room, the tension between them was palpable. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room, but it did little to ease the chill that had settled in James's heart. He looked around at the space Amelia had created for herself, a life built from the ground up without him. It was a life that was simple, unassuming, but rich in the ways that his had never been. Amelia sat across from him, her eyes thoughtful as if she could sense the storm brewing within him. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, James," she said gently, breaking the silence. "We've both been through a lot these past few days. Maybe it's best if we just let things settle for a bit." But James shook his head, the decision weighing heavily on his mind. "I've spent my entire life putting off decisions, Amelia. Always thinking there'd be more time, that things would somehow work. But I've realized that time doesn't wait for anyone. If I've learned anything from all of this, it's that we can't keep running from our past." Amelia looked at him, her expression unreadable. "And what is it that you want, James? What do you want from all of this?" The question hung in the air, and James found himself at a loss for words. What did he want? For so long, his life had been about chasing success, about building something that he thought would make him happy. But standing here, in Amelia's home, he realized that the one thing he had always truly wanted had been within his reach all along, and he had let it slip away. He sighed, his voice heavy with regret. I want to make things right. I want to be with you, Amelia. I know I can't change the past, but maybe we can build something new. Together." Amelia's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, James saw a glimmer of hope in them. "I've always wondered what might have been," she said quietly. "But I'm not the same person I was back then, and neither are you. We've both changed, and I think that's okay. Maybe it's even a good thing." James nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Maybe it is. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm asking you to take a risk, to trust me, after all this time." Amelia smiled back, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Life is full of risks, James, but some risks are worth taking." As the night wore on, they talked more, sharing their hopes, their fears, and their regrets. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if the years apart had only deepened their connection. For the first time in decades, James felt a sense of peace. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. But as the evening drew to a close, the reality of their situation loomed large. James had a life in Willow Creek, a life he had built over the years, full of responsibilities and commitments. And as much as he wanted to stay, to build a new life with Amelia, he knew that it wasn't as simple as just deciding to stay. That night, as he lay in the guest room of Amelia's home, staring up at the ceiling, James found himself at a crossroads. The decision he made now would shape the rest of his life. He could return to Willow Creek, to the life he knew, or he could take the leap, risking everything for the chance at a second chance with Amelia. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt full of possibilities. James awoke with a sense of clarity that had eluded him the night before. As he dressed and made his way downstairs, he found Amelia already in the kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee. "Good morning," she said, smiling as he entered. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," James replied, though his mind was still heavy with the decision he knew he had to make. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about last night." Amelia looked at him expectantly, her hands stilling as she poured the coffee. "And?" James took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent so much of my life chasing after things that I thought would make me happy. But the truth is, the happiest I've ever been was when I was here, with you. I don't want to go back to that empty life, Amelia. I want to stay. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." For a moment, Amelia said nothing, the weight of his words sinking in. Then slowly, she set down the coffee pot and crossed the room to where James stood. She reached out, taking his hands in hers, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure, James? This isn't just about making up for lost time?" "No," James said firmly, his voice steady. "This is about finally doing what I should have done all those years ago. It's about choosing love over everything else. I know it won't be easy, and I know we have a lot of work to do. But I'm ready for that, if you are." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of happiness, of relief. "I'm ready too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so many years wondering what might have been. But now we have a chance to find out." They stood there for a long moment, the gravity of the decision they had made settling around them. It wasn't just about rekindling an old romance. It was about building something new, something that would stand the test of time. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, James and Amelia began the process of building their life together. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, of frustration, as they navigated the challenges that came with merging two very different, but there was also joy and laughter, and a deep sense of fulfillment that neither of them had felt in years. They spent their days exploring the town, rediscovering the places that had once held so much meaning for them. They rebuilt the bonfire on the beach, this time successfully lighting it, and they sat together under the stars talking about their hopes for the future. They visited the lighthouse often, finding solace in the familiarity of the place that had once brought them so much heartache, but now symbolized their journey towards healing. In the end, they found that while they couldn't change the past, they could create a new future together. And that future, built on a foundation of love, trust, and shared experiences, was more than either of them had ever hoped for. As the years passed, James and Amelia grew older, but they did so together, finding comfort and companionship in each other's presence. And though their love had been tested by time, it had endured, stronger and more resilient than ever. In the twilight of their lives, they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the ocean, their hands intertwined. And in that moment, they knew that they had finally found the peace and happiness they had been searching for all along. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales, and don't forget to leave a comment. I love reading your thoughts. Thank you for watching.